No one has to be reminded of the significance of events in the Persian Gulf region to the economies of the industrial world, to the evolution of the regime in Iran, to Arab fundamentalism, to the U.S.-Soviet relations, or to the long-term well-being of the region. Nor is one unaware of the complexity and the risks, therefore, in the current state of affairs. We are extraordinarily fortunate to have with us this evening to discuss this matter of the region, the foreign policy of Kuwait in particular, the distinguished representative of the state of Kuwait to the United States, Shaikh Saud, Al-Sabah. In 1968, Ambassador Al-Sabah became a barrister at law after studying at Gray's Inn in London. He joined Kuwait's Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1969. Among his diplomatic assignments has been to represent Kuwait at the Seabed Commission of the United Nations, 1969 through 1973, of which he was elected vice chairman. He later served as the vice chairman of the delegation of Kuwait to the Law of the Seas Conference, 74 through 75, and was elected vice chairman of that conference. He was Kuwait's ambassador to the Court of St. James, 1975 through 1980, and non-resident ambassador to Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. He served as president of the International Maritime Consultation Organization in London, 1979 through 80. Since 1981, he has been his state's ambassador to the United States and non-resident representative to Canada and Venezuela. The evening's subject matter is of fundamental importance and is timely, and our guest is notable. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Shaikh Saud Al-Sabah, Ambassador of the State of Kuwait to the United States. Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson, for your very kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, may I first of all express to you my deep appreciation for your kind attendance this evening to hear what I have to talk about on the Kuwait foreign policy. My appreciation also goes to the Council on Foreign Affairs for giving me this very unique opportunity to come and to speak to such distinguished representatives and to such distinguished people in the Baltimore city area. I have never been to Baltimore before. I'm ashamed to say that. I've been in Washington for 7 years now. I've crossed by Baltimore either by air or by road, but I've always heard of Baltimore. We always dealt with Baltimore on the commercial basis, but I have missed, I think, this city, and we should make it a point to come and spend some time here. I have not tonight prepared any speech to deliver to you tonight. I think the rapid development in world politics, especially in the Gulf area, prevents any person in my status to prepare any kind of speech. The moment you are to deliver a speech, something else happens new, which nullifies any terms or any subject that you wish to talk about. There is one standing thing, I think, which I'm able to talk about repeatedly, and that is the Kuwait foreign policy, which has been and will continue to be the same as long as there is a Kuwait. Since our independence, our foreign policy has been based on the principles and the proper non-alignment policy that we have followed throughout the years since 1961. Since our independence, we have opened the doors of relations between the West and the East simultaneously on equal footings. We have dealt with the Western powers, we have dealt with the Eastern powers. We initiated diplomatic relations with the United States, with the European countries. At the same time, we initiated diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union, with China, and the Eastern Bloc. Many countries would seem to think that this is a very odd policy for a small nation like Kuwait, especially entangled in that very crucial area. There should be some kind of an alignment with certain power. For the sake of protection, for the sake of having the continuation of the existing of such a small nation, not to be entangled with the East and the West. That could be true sometimes. Many nations have opted for such policies. But our view has always been that for us to exist and to coexist with larger neighbors in the Gulf, we should have an open policy between the East and the West. We should benefit from the technology, from the relationship we have with the Western nations. At the same time, we could not, at any instance, block any kind of relationship with a superpower much closer to Kuwait in our area, and the superpower in the area. We cannot block any kind of relationship with the Soviet Union, notwithstanding any kind of differences that we might have as far as politics or ideologies between us and them. We continue to enjoy the best of kind relationship with the West and the East. I'm not denying the fact that our relationship with the United States, even before our independence 61, has been one of the most closest ties of friendship and understanding and cooperation in all fields. We've had extensive cooperation in the military cooperation. We've had extensive cooperation in the investment, in economics, in culture, what have you. We've sent our young ones to the United States to study. At any given moment, we have over 4,000 Kuwaiti students studying under scholarships from my government in the United States. And that is an indication how we foresee this whole thing. Many of our students, since the years past, since independence, have come back with a U.S. educational background, with the U.S. educational understanding that helps the integration of our two people and the understanding of our two people. We've also embarked on a huge investment policy in the United States. At any given time since our independence, we have diverted 10% of our gross national income per year to a fund which is called the Fund for Future Generation, which has been invested in the United States. Now, this fund exceeds $60 billion in the United States itself. That's an indication for you, again, how we view our relationship with the United States economically and culturally. We continue to pursue this policy. We continue to pursue a better understanding and a better relationship at all fields. Our foreign policy also was based on foreign aid. Kuwait was blessed with the exploration of oil in Kuwait, and we thought it's only right that underdeveloped nations, nations in need, should be assisted by our program. We created a $3 billion fund to assist underdeveloped nations and developing countries in their infrastructure and in their needs as they dictated to us. Many countries seem to think that foreign aid goes with political intimidation or political demands. We have never exercised such policy. There are many countries who we give aid to and support them. Sometimes we find them going against our interests. Many countries we have given aid to, continue to give aid to, we found them voting against our interests in the United Nations Security Council. But that has never deterred us from the continuation of this policy. I think in the long run, people do understand our bona fide interests and bona fide intentions. The problem that is always troubling us in the area is for so many years, the whole Middle East area, stretching from the Gulf right to the Mediterranean, has become a center for regional crises and regional tensions. We have been, since 1948, engaged in the what's so-called the Arab-Israeli conflict. We have been through so many wars in that area, so many discussions, so many negotiations, so many conferences have been taking place in order to find a solution to this problem. We continue to hold our position in this field. We continue to hold the position that the Palestinian state should be created for the Palestinian people. What the Palestinian people want and desire would be our position for them to support them. I think after this so many years, now we're embarking on a new era. Such an era now will entail holding an international conference with the full participation of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council and with the countries involved in this problem. Hopefully we are proceeding cautiously but effectively in order to get a settlement to this problem. Coincidentally, this problem has been, for so many years, a center of disagreement, which I would call personally the only center of disagreement that we've had with the United States over the solution to the Palestinian question. Once we get this behind us, I think we can hope for a better understanding even more. The other problem we had was the Lebanese crisis. This Lebanon was torn apart by conflicts, internal conflicts, foreign intervention, invasion by other countries. And I'm sad to say that situation is as it exists and is even worse than it has been before. We don't see a light at the end of the tunnel as of yet, until and unless there is a conciliation between the Lebanese people themselves without any foreign interference in their affairs. The subject, which is, I think, made Kuwait quite recently more known than before, is the Iran-Iraq war. Since 1980, we have lived in an area and followed this the most tragic, the most bloodiest war that we have witnessed in our history. This war has been going on since 1980. Many efforts were exerted on the international level, on regional level, trying to find an equitable solution to this war. You might call it war of ideologies, you might call it border disputes, you might call it religious fanaticism, whatever you want to call it. But it is a war taking place between 2 nations with lives being lost every day in hundreds and hundreds of thousands. It's senseless. Nobody could understand this war, and there is no way up to now we have found a way to end this war. Being a neighbor to Iraq and Iran in the Gulf, we maintained a policy of neutrality. We tried at the beginning of the war to mediate between the 2 warring factions. We tried to bring the Iranians to understand that it's not in their long-term interest to create this sense of hostility with their Arab neighbors in the Gulf. Since the beginning of the Iranian Revolution, their slogans were always, number 1, to export the revolution to neighboring countries. Number 2, to create a havoc in those countries. And number 3, to have the sect, the Shia sect, being implanted as a government in those countries. Of course, such slogans cannot and will not ever be accepted by our people, let alone by our countries. We continued our good offices with the Iranians with no success at all. As the war developed we found ourselves gradually being dragged into this war by Iranian activities. It started by acts of terror in Kuwait. One of them was the bombing of the US Embassy in Kuwait, plus the French Embassy and other Kuwaiti installations. It's a huge list of terrorist acts that took place in Kuwait with the identification of Iranian interests behind it. After that incident, Kuwait apprehended the culprits. They were put through a proper judicial procedure where they were tried, convicted, and sentenced. Since then, we have been under tremendous pressure from the Iranians to release them. That would tantamount to giving in to terrorism. And we said it, and we repeat to say it, that we will never give in to terrorism if that takes the security of our country. The moment you give in to terrorism, then there is no end to it. You become a hostage to the terrorists, and you will continue to be a hostage to the terrorists. As this position was maintained, the Iranians escalated their terrorist acts in Kuwait. Recently, only yesterday, car bomb in Kuwait. The day before that, we had the Pan Am office blown up in Kuwait. Kuwait has always been an open society. We have invited so many foreigners in Kuwait. With a population of 1.6 million, we have nearly 1 million foreigners in Kuwait. You might ask, why do you have 1 million? I would say it's a developing country. We are developing our country. We need the manpower. We need the technology in every sense. But we do not need terrorists at any time. Our security measures were highly escalated in Kuwait. We're very particular about letting in people who have no proper background. But notwithstanding these measures, you cannot prevent such acts taking place without having a state of military state conducted in the country itself. The Iranians took on later a different approach. They started attacking our ships, our oil tankers, flying the Kuwaiti flag, coming from Kuwait. By doing this, they practically exercised a semi-blockade on Kuwait itself. We were not able, to some extent, to export our oil to our contractors. We were not able to finance our budget because of the export of oil. We used foreign ships. We leased foreign ships to export our oil in order to prevent Iranian attacks on our ships. They continued attacking ships, not just Kuwaiti flag ships, but any ship coming to or from Kuwait. We were in a dilemma, quite frankly, how we would face this problem. We took a decision that I think the 5 permanent members of the Security Council have and should have the prime responsibility of the maintenance of international peace and security around the world. We approached them and we said, we have a problem as a small nation. Our lifeline depends on our export of oil. The lifeline of the industrialized nations which we export oil to, mainly Japan, depends on our oil. Could you please do something about it? Is there any way we could find a way to prevent Iranian attacks on our ships? We offer them 2 choices. When I say them, the 5 permanent members. One, either to lease us ships flying their flags, or to accept registering our ships or our tankers, when I refer to them as ships, in their countries. We were provoked by this feeling that at least the flying of a sovereign nation or a superpower flag on one of those ships would be somehow a deterrent to the Iranians from attacking those ships. Well, as the negotiation progressed with the 5 nations I referred to, we reached a conclusion that the United States was not able to lease us ships, which was our original request, because the U.S. government does not own ships for leasing. Ships are usually owned by U.S. companies. Those U.S. companies were so afraid to lease us ships to operate in the Gulf, as the insurance rate skyrocketed. The Soviets came back and said, we will lease you ships. Well, the system, the Soviets, is different from the United States. All ships there are owned by the government. We concluded agreement with the Soviets to lease 3 ships to carry our oil. The United States came back and said, we are willing to register your ships in the United States, which now been known as reflagging. We said, of course, we are in the market for it. We appreciate it. We highly appreciate the gesture. So the discussion went that we were registering our ships in the United States, flying the Star and Stripes, and the Soviets, they were leasing us 3 ships, flying their flag in the Gulf. Eventually, the British came by also and accepted registering some of our tankers in the United Kingdom, flying the Union Jack. The Chinese and the French, we have not up to now got any response from them yet. Well, as this progressed, everything looked so fine. Here we have the US flag, ships, tankers flying the flags, and we have the Soviets. And we thought the Iranians would not at least dare to attack those ships. Then the Iranians moved on to a different tactic, and that is mines. They started mining the whole entrance to the Kuwait shipping lanes and the whole Gulf area. Some of the reflag tankers ran into some mines, incurred some damage, but we understood it. We didn't think that it should be a pretext for an escalation. Then the United States thought that this situation cannot continue without having some kind of a military protection for the US flag ships. Well, we said, of course, this is a decision that has to be made by the United States and by the United States only. These ships are now flying your flag. If you wish to have military protection, or what's called now escort for those ships, we again highly appreciate it, but it's your decision to do it. There is a perfect right for you to do it in the high seas, or what is known as international waters in the Gulf, and it's your decision. The United States saw fit that military escort should be provided, and they went ahead with it. At that time, the Soviets had only just 1 military ship escorting those tankers. As the US military force moved in, so did a Soviet escalation in their military ships protecting their flags. Then we saw a different turnover. We saw the French, the Italian, the Dutch, the Belgians have all moved in now. It's quite understandable. Now, we have been blamed by some sources that we brought the superpowers into the Gulf. Now, let me make that very, very clear. We did not bring the superpowers into the Gulf. We didn't bring foreign naval forces into the Gulf. It's only because of Iranian actions. It's because of Iranian intimidation. It's because of the Iranian terrorism. It's because of the Iranians' obstruction of the freedom of navigation in the Gulf that those foreign powers are in the area. It's the prime responsibility of the international body, or I would say the superpowers, to guarantee the freedom of navigation in the Gulf and through the Straits of Hormuz in the Gulf. Many would say, where would you go? Where do we go from now? There we have all those nations' fleets in the Gulf. We have 30 U.S. warships, and in comparison, about 30 other foreign nations' warships in the area. We don't like this a bit. Nobody in the area likes this. No one wants to see a tension, an escalation in the tension in the Gulf. But what would we do if you are really forced to do it by the Iranians? We are a small nation. We cannot face the Iranians militarily, and the only source we have is to resort to international mediation, and if not, some kind of international protection for our shipping and trade. The Iranians recently fired missiles hitting U.S. flagships in our territorial waters. And that was a very clever act on their part. First of all, they challenged the U.S. flag on the ship, and number two, they challenged our territorial sovereignty in our territorial waters. Many asked, what are you going to do? Well, what would you do if you have 1.5 or 1.6 million people vis-a-vis about 50 million people across the Gulf? What would you do if you have no intention of escalating this into an outright war in the Gulf? We knew the United States was up to something. We knew very well the United States was planning some kind of retaliatory act, because there was a domestic cry in the United States on the level of public opinion, in the media, and in Congress, that the United States should do something. Eventually, the United States did. They did what they termed as a measured, calculated, and proportionate retaliation to Iran. The moment that act took place, which so many nations thought that we knew about it, we didn't know about it. We weren't consulted by the United States. We knew after the fact. But there's one thing we knew, that the Iranians will retaliate, not against the United States, but against us. And that tantamounted that the Iranians are settling their scores with the United States on our expense. Next day, what is called a Silkworm missile flies across and hits our offloading oil installation, causing tremendous damage to the whole thing. Now, this is the situation we find ourselves in. Where do we go from here? I ask the question again. We have a Security Council Resolution 598 passed unanimously by the Security Council for a ceasefire. The Iranians were able to manipulate that resolution. They refused to abide by it. And the main demand is that we should have a committee looking into who was the aggressor in this war before we would accept any ceasefire. The United Nations Secretary General said, okay, we will have an impartial, I repeat, impartial committee to look into the aggressor and identify the aggressor in this war. And they asked the Iranians, coincidentally, well, suppose the impartial committee comes back and says, well, you were the aggressors. What would you do? The Prime Minister said, well, if they say that, then they're not impartial. So the situation is becoming a very cat and mouse game, I would call it, with the Iranians. Now they were given until the end of this month to come back, or the past month, October, now, matter of fact, we are in November, to come back and reply to the United Nations, to the Secretary General, whether finally accept ceasefire or not. They came back yesterday. It hasn't been made public yet. With another maneuver in their, or tactical maneuver in their reply. which there is a clear indication. Nobody doubts it. We don't doubt it in the area. Iran does not want to stop this war. Iran has made their position very clear since the beginning of the revolution. They have certain targets they want to achieve, and they will not stop short of those targets. For that reason, I think we have to look at it in a different perspective. We have to evaluate our interests collectively. We have to review our bilateral interests with our friends. And I think such maneuver that took place in the Gulf, I think has showed us the interest of the United States taken in the area, the interest that has been expressed by the United States towards us as their friends in the area. We should work together with the United States, with other friendly nations, and we should also, at the same time, try as much as we can to put an end to this war. We know that other nations are fueling it even more and more, not naming any nation in particular. There are nations still selling arms to the Iranians. As long as the Iranians have the cash, the hard currency to buy arms, they'll buy it from different sources. They'll continue this war. They have the human resources. They'll throw in their 12-year-old children to the front and have them killed. They don't care as far as this ideology, and this government just continues to thrive on these hostilities. The move by the United States to introduce a sanction resolution or a boycott resolution of arms to Iran, well, it has been thrown forward and backward again in the United Nations Security Council. The position of the Soviet Union on this resolution is still very timid. The Chinese are not very enthusiastic about it. The British and the French will go along if the United States pushes. But I suppose, just for argument purposes, suppose that such a resolution is passed. What guarantees do we have that there will not be under the table arms going into Iran? It's a very difficult situation for us to face. It's very difficult for us to try to tackle such a problem where we are dealing with conflict of interests between the East and the West. And the position of those other superpowers is not being made very clear at all to us. Now we are embarking on two alternatives on the international level. One, either to just sit and wait to see what the Security Council will do vis-à-vis the recent Iranian response about establishing a so-called impartial committee, or to go ahead with this sanction resolution. And quite frankly, that's the only solution that is available to us as small nations to pursue. On the military level, we cannot eliminate the possibility that there will be escalation in the Gulf. There is imminent danger that the Iranians will do something. Their acts are very unpredictable. They might do something which will endanger U.S. lives, they might endanger U.S. ships, might endanger our territorial sovereignty at the same time. And then we have to face this together. But before I conclude my brief remarks, which I wanted to just throw to the audience here, and I would be more than pleased to indulge in question and answers afterwards. The most important thing I think we have to address ourselves to is that we are facing this matter collectively. We are working closely on this crisis in the Gulf. And let me make it very clear that my government and my people appreciate what the United States is doing, appreciate very highly what the United States is doing for us. Let there be no doubt that I think this will be registered in history for a symbol for joint and friendly relations between my country and the United States. We realize that there are young Americans there in those ships, their lives in jeopardy. Nobody denies this. And I think we are as careful as you are not to escalate this to become an outright war where we all stand to lose in it. conclusion, may I thank you all for your kind attendance this evening, for your kind patience and understanding, and let's hope that next time I get this opportunity to speak here again, it will be on a much happier and a lighter note than this. Thank you very much.
Mr. Ambassador, we thank you for your brief remarks, which were in fact comprehensive and thoughtful. The ambassador has agreed to answer questions until 10 minutes after 7. Professor Friedman.
Ambassador, you used very kind words in describing the Soviet Union as timid on the resolution. If I recall properly, 2 months ago, your foreign minister, also Sheikh Sabah, led an Arab delegation to Moscow to try to convince the Soviets to take a harder line toward Iran. At that time, the Soviets said, Iran will moderate, Iran will agree. Now, it's the end of October, the Iranians have said no. At this stage, it would appear that the Soviets are clearly tilting toward Iran. Under the circumstances, would you consider what a number of Americans have suggested, and that is to enable the United States to better defend Kuwait, to give the United States military facilities on Kuwaiti soil?
Professor Friedman has suggested that the Soviet Union is tilting toward Iran. Given that assumption, the question is, would your state, Mr. Ambassador, agree to consider the possibility of American military installations on your soil?
Let me first of all correct the first part of your question, Professor Friedman. The first part of the question regarding the visit of my foreign minister to Moscow was within the Committee of 7 by the Arab League, which has been indulging extensively in finding a solution to this war. So he was there within that committee and not as a separate and a unit by himself. Now, this question, I think I've heard it so many times, and I have only one answer to it, regarding facilities or bases. I believe if you are fully informed, Mr. Friedman, in the problem of the discussions of bases of facilities, you would have come across and followed the Congress hearings, committee hearings on the subject of the Gulf crisis, which I believe I could refer you to Secretary Weinberger's briefing, and I could refer you to Assistant Secretary Richard Murphy's briefing. He was asked that question by distinguished senators and congressmen. Why are the Kuwaitis not giving us bases or facilities? And their answer was that we have not asked for it, and we will not ask for it. We do not need it, and there is no need for it. Now, I see you shaking your head no, but let me say something. If that's the testimony of your Secretary of Defense, and if that's the testimony of your Middle East expert in the State Department, do you have any other statements from U.S. officials who have demanded this? Because let me tell you quite frankly, this subject was never brought up between us and the United States. The United States knows our foreign policy very well. And I said at the beginning of my remarks that we do not intend to divert from it. It's neither in the interest of my country, it's neither in the interest of the United States vis-a-vis the U.S.-Iranian relationship, if you understand what I mean, to have any kind of a U.S. presence or bases in the Gulf area. Having said that, I think we are working together with the United States, and I said in my remarks, we are working together, we are collaborating together, we are doing what the United States regards as satisfactory given the prevailing political situation in the area. Giving bases or facilities doesn't solve the problem, Professor Friedman. Giving bases or facilities is a step towards having an outright war. If a war should break up in the area, then there are situations to change, and then matters become more, I think, difficult in analyzing than where we stand today.
Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned that there are 4,000 students studying here. Do you also have people studying in the Soviet Union and other countries?
The question is, do you have your students studying in the Soviet Union and other countries?
Where is the lady who asked the question? Oh, okay, sorry. Yes, we do have. We have 60 students. We have 60 students studying there in a specialized field. I think my cultural counselor here knows the field that they're studying there, but we have about 60 students, which is no way could compare to the number we have over here.
Yes, ma'am, on the aisle.
You originally said that you were trying to get protection for your tankers, and I presume you said you were a quite rich country. You were paying for it originally, but you couldn't get any country to come in and protect your tankers. Now that the United States is in there and it is ships for profit, are you helping to alleviate some of the costs that we're paying out to protect the tankers?
The question is your state helping to supplement or support the costs which the United States incurs in protecting and flagging the tankers?
The tankers were registered in the United States. Matter of fact, across the bay in Delaware here. So they are subject to U.S. tax laws and regulations and what goes with it. Regarding question about subsidizing or paying for the protection, I said in my remarks that protection was not requested by us. It was a decision made by the United States to protect their own flagships as foreign policy of the United States. There has been many articles and many movements inside Congress talking about this subject, about who is paying for this and so on and so forth. But I think this is a very shallow kind of argument to indulge with. Here we are dealing with a superpower. We are dealing with a very important strategical area where there is superpower rivalry in the area. Now, if we're going to talk about peanuts, about paying for those escorts $10 million or $20 million or so, I think we are demeaning the whole objective of this whole foreign policy move. Wait a minute. No, not the lives. I'm talking about the cost, my dear. Don't misunderstand me. You're talking about the cost of this amount. The United States has said it, that they're not asking for us to subsidize this. It's a position that they are taking. They have fleets in the Caribbean. They have fleets in the Mediterranean. Is there anybody there paying for the upkeep of those fleets in other areas? That's a decision to be made by the United States, not by us.
Yes, Ms. Van Bremen.
I'd like to ask you, Ambassador, you said that a Kuwait was neutral, but the way I heard your delivery tonight, it was Iran was attacking you. Now, the United States has reflagged your ships, so as far as I see it, the United States has taken your side with Iraq, so we're actually not neutral. Would you please explain what Iraq has to do with this?
The question is, would you comment on the implication that the United States, by flagging your tankers, is in fact tilting toward Iraq and is not neutral in the war between Iran and Iraq?
I think that's a question for a U.S. administration official to answer. But our position, as we see it, we are a non-belligerent party in this war. we're not party to this war. And we don't wish to be. We would like to remain outside this hostilities. And what the United States is doing, and I think if I recall the points raised by U.S. officials, what are we doing there? What is our objective there? And there were 4 or 5 objectives said or raised by the U.S. officials there. One is to protect international navigation in the Gulf. That's one objective. 2, to protect neutral shipping from attacks by Iran. 3, to check Soviet influence in the Gulf, plus other 2 which are relevant now to this discussion. But the point which you raised is that we are non-belligerent in this war. And the United States is what the United States is doing now, what the British are doing now. By coincidentally, they're not asking for any cost to be borne by their protection also. What the French are doing, which we are not also asking for any costs. And the Soviets is trying to guarantee freedom of navigation in the Gulf and to protect neutral shipping. Now, unless such an international law principle can be preserved and guarded, we're going to live in a jungle around this world. Any nation could take upon itself and attack all those ships, and non-belligerent ships, and neutral ships, and create some kind of havoc and a blockade of our country. So that's, I think, would be answering the question.
I don't think you want to answer my question from something you said in your speech, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What countries are supplying both Iraq and Iran with arms, etc.?
The question was prefaced by the observation that you may not want to answer this question. The question is, would you identify those countries which are supplying both Iran and Iraq with arms?
I think I need a very long list. It seems to be that so many, every single country in this world is supplying arms to the two warring factions. I'm not talking about the Iran-Contra hearing and something else. But there's so many countries supplying arms to the warring parties since 1980. There is in the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc. Now, if we take one country aside, if you say who's supplying Iraq, I could give you a complete list. If you're saying who's supplying Iran, there's another list to be there. But some countries who are supplying Iran now deny it, but they are maybe doing it indirectly through third countries. But we know the identity of those weapons that are hitting our territory. We know where those weapons are made. We know where those mines are manufactured. How did they get there? I mean, either directly or indirectly. So once you know the identity or the place where those weapons are manufactured, then you assume that they came from that source, whether directly or indirectly. I mean, if you find Hawk missiles in Iran, you know Hawk missiles are not made in Timbuktu. They are made in the United States. So this is the...
I would enjoy very much to have you give us your analysis of the most important point that has not been brought up. And that is, in your estimation of the Iranian government, the old boy isn't going to be around all the time. And sooner or later, it's going to have a change. Will it be violent? My personal guess is yes. How many parties are going to vie for power? The best I've been able to put together is roughly 4 right now. But I'd be most interested in yours. You've tracked the armaments. Now, how good can you give us on the political situation in Iran?
The question is, would you comment on your view of the evolution of the regime in Iran?
I would be more than happy to give you my personal evaluation, what the whole...
That'd be a good one for starters.
Well, and I think it will be put to just 2 words. I don't know. No, wait a minute. I think if anybody knew, I think nobody, I think around the world, even the United States with the huge intelligence capability, knows exactly what's going on inside Iran. Wait a minute. You know, there's a complete disorder inside Iran. But there's one given thing, that the enshrined ideology, or the ideology itself, is very much enshrined in the whole Iranian philosophy. If you go around Iran, I think now, we see no apparent possibility that there will be any change in their ideology, whether it is what some people like to call it fundamentalism, or whatever you want to call it, or fanatics. But going down from the Ayatollah, going right down to the bottom, you see the people are there behind him. And the more the Iranians confronting, or Iran is confronting war with Iraq and war with, practically now with the whole world now, is the more this, I think, hard line inside Iran is stronger and gathers around this ideology. So we don't see, quite frankly, a change in the near future, and we have to learn to live with it. And they are quite willing to have what kind of system they have in their own country. We will respect it, we will live with it. But for God's sake, keep it within your boundaries, whatever you want to have. You have a democratic system, dictatorial system, keep it with you, but don't try to export it to us. We don't need it. So your idea is where we go, nobody exactly knows. I mean, anything could happen in Iran, and there's so many possibilities out there.
Don't we have in Iran former students? They were over here by the tens of thousands and became proficient engineers under the Shah. And they had the highest standard of living, and they understood the United States. They understood what a good standard of living is.
Mm-hmm.
They're in there someplace. And I'm looking for them to show themselves at the proper moment.
Go and find them, my dear. Go and find them.
Mr. Rich wants to know where all the westernized Americans are in Iran. Yes, sir.
I have a question about the situation internally. If you have, let's say, as I understand, like 60% of the population is foreign, that is, they're not citizens, is that correct? 60% approximately out of a million. And I understand, too, that perhaps 20% of those that remain of the citizens are Shia. Don't you have an internal challenge if these people feel that they don't have full rights, feel some way second class? Do you have any kind of a internal challenge then because of this situation?
The question is whether you feel that the substantial Shia population within your state, given the Iranian ideology, creates at least a major problem for your regime.
You know, what really, I think, disturbed me from your question was that they don't have their full rights. I don't really agree with this, because even though they are from the Shia sect in Islam, they are Kuwaitis and they enjoy full rights as Kuwaitis. You know, my friend, we've never differentiated in our history, since I grew up in Kuwait, let alone my father's grandfathers. We've never differentiated between Sunnis or Shias or whatever you have in Kuwait. It's only because of the Iranian Revolution that took place, which aroused the religious feelings about the Shias and so on and so forth. And it's because of their struggle with Iraq and their fighting with Iraq has really created some kind of promise of an Islamic uprising, you know, led by the Shia in Iran. I'm not denying we had problems in Kuwait. We were facing some elements in Kuwait, young people who were really, I would say, brainwashed by such promises, you know, by the Iranians. At the beginning of the revolution, they thought, well, that's going to be, you know, the revolution which the leader and we'll be the followers. That's from the Shia's point of view. But I think as the time progressed and they saw what that regime is doing in massacres in executions and so on and so forth, which is not much better than the regime before that. They understood that, or they came around to understand that that's not proper Islamic revolution. That's just another hegemony over this whole area. So I'm not denying we had some small factions in Kuwait, from Kuwaitis. I'm not denying that. It's been public. It's been publicized that and underwent some kind of a terrorist acts in Kuwait, who were, agitated or encouraged by Iran. They were apprehended. They were tried. They were convicted. But that happens. I mean, you cannot really prevent it, because some people do have certain ideologies or thinking or attachment to certain things, which, let alone, and coincidentally, some of those people who were really arrested in Kuwait, just for this, to follow up on this point, they're not hard-earned people. They're not poor people who did these things. Some of them are engineers working in Kuwait, earning tremendous amounts of money. They have their own houses, their own cars, living lavishly in Kuwait. And they chose to do such things and subject themselves, their families, and their children to this kind of treatment because of their ideology. These fanatic ideas do come up. We had problems, but we are trying to control it, and we are trying to, I would say, not overplay it and not overreact to it. Because after all, I think this whole ideology of Khomeini is a passing thing, like we had at the time of Nasir, at the time when Egypt came. And everybody was an Arab nationalist, everybody was wants to do something, and this just passed. You have to learn to live with it, not really end to it. Somebody making signs there. Okay, fine. Sorry.
Yes, sir.
There was one element in the question that the gentleman on the right there asked, which I'm not sure I answered clearly. And that is, in essence, what do you think will happen or what effect do you think Khomeini's passing from the scene would have on the internal politics of
Passing what?
The question was, beyond what you've said so far, what effect do you think the passing